Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kevin Quigley. I'm the director of the MacEachen Institute for Public Policy and Governance at Dalhousie University. Thanks so much for joining us today on what I'm sure is going to be an extremely interesting and timely discussion around energy. We start today by acknowledging that we are in McConaghy, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We also would like to acknowledge that today is Treaty Day, a day to promote public awareness about Mi'kmaq culture and heritage for all Nova Scotians. On that point, I want to make an important note about today's panel. So I think many of us would agree, all of us would agree, I hope, that an Indigenous perspective on energy and resource extraction is extremely important. We do not have that perspective, partly because of the scheduling conflict with Treaty Day. We tried our best to secure an Indigenous speaker, but unfortunately they're tied up. I was kind of hoping that we'd get lucky because they'd all be in Halifax. Many of the people would be in Halifax. They could offer a perspective. But they are engaged in a luncheon between 12 and 2, which is one of the sort of key events of the day. So unfortunately, we were unable to secure an Indigenous speaker. On that note, though, I'll just make a couple of points. One is that we have a list of references for you. So if you're in the policy class, we'll make readings available to you that address specifically the issue of energy and Indigenous perspective. If you're not part of the class, we have listed those references here in a document, and we've made copies of that document and made it available to the side. So if you'd like to pick up a copy of the list of references that we're providing to the students in the class, these readings all address issues around Indigenous perspectives on energy and resource extraction. So we encourage you to familiarize yourselves with those readings. I do believe, though, we have an extremely knowledgeable and experienced panel today, and I'm anxious to get started on the topic. So I'll also mention next week our panel discussion addresses issues of reconciliation. We'll be discussing human rights and reconciliation, Indigenous child welfare. It features Angelina Amaral, Cindy Blackstock, and Naomi Metallic, and I think it's going to be also a very timely and interesting topic. We'd like to welcome those of you who've joined us on the live stream. We're always happy to see a large crowd on the live stream. And it falls to me to introduce today's chair, Larry Hughes. Larry Hughes is a professor at Dalhousie University, where he teaches undergraduate computer engineering courses and an interdisciplinary graduate course in energy systems analysis. He's also a founding fellow at the MacEachen Institute for Public Policy and Governance. His research interests focus on the means by which a jurisdiction can identify, quantify, and mitigate the risks to the energy security of its energy system while transforming to a low-carbon economy. He's written reports on electric vehicles for Nova Scotia Power and has had several UARB hearings on electricity rates and the maritime link. Larry played a key role in putting the panel together, and I'm delighted that he was able to do so. So without further ado, Larry Hughes. Larry.
Okay, I'll begin with an apology. I have a cold. My throat is on the verge of collapsing, but I will do the best I can. Okay, today we're extremely fortunate to have 3 exceptional panelists, and the panel is being asked to answer the following question. Can Canada's energy future address the environmental concerns and land disputes while still generating a successful and profitable energy industry? Or will the needs of various stakeholders leave us in a perpetual state of conflict? A week ago, we had the climate protests, and last Friday we had climate protests as well, calling for a 1.5 degree stabilization of emissions by the end of this century. And part of the process of stabilizing these emissions, we've been asked to have our emissions from 2020 levels to by 2030. What we want to do is take an existing energy system and make radical changes to it. This is Nova Scotia's final energy demand at this stage in 2017. This is the most recent data from the National Inventory Report from Environment Canada. What we see is, well, I should say first, final energy demand is the energy that's used by Nova Scotians. This is after it's gone through processing such as electricity. So we're talking about electricity, not the energy that goes into electricity. So you notice the gasoline for transportation is about a third, diesel 15%, light fuel oil for heating purposes, and other oils that are used for example, aviation fuels and so forth. That's 2/3 of the province's energy demand. A quarter of it's from electricity, and about 8% is from natural gas. So what is key as far as we're concerned right now is, for this talk, is how we go from 66% of our energy source to essentially to have this. There's two energy security issues that are essentially will be addressed in part by the panel. The first is the Irving Oil St. John refinery supply in 2018, ignoring that part. Yes, Nova Scotia gets these oil products, gasoline and so forth. It gets them from the Irving refinery. The Irving refinery produces these products for us in this province from crude oil. And the crude oil itself comes from other countries. In fact, the majority of it comes from other countries, about 85%. Of this, about 40% of the St. John's refinery's input is from Saudi Arabia. We can say to ourselves, well, it's been stable all this time. Last year, when there was a diplomatic spat between Saudi Arabia and Canada, and students were taken out of Dalhousie and other universities across the country, the oil supplies continue to flow in. However, as you know, about 3 weeks ago, the Abqaiq refinery in Saudi Arabia was attacked. And Saudi Arabia is blaming Iran, the United States is siding with the Saudis. If anything was to happen to this supply, the Straits of Hormuz were to close, for example, the question is, where would that energy come from? Many politicians are arguing what we should be doing is extending a pipeline from Western Canada to Eastern Canada. This was going to be originally Energy East. This is now no longer on the cards, or as one of the panelists will address in detail. Excuse me. So, it's getting worse. So one energy security issue we have is security of supply. The other is we want to have our emissions by the end of the next decade. If we take 2017 as a proxy for 2020 and just have these emissions and ask ourselves, how are we going to reduce these emissions? And what you notice is, yes, there's electricity, but right now we're just, for this talk, we're focusing on the oil-based emissions. And these primarily come from transportation and buildings. And what you're seeing is you have to ask yourself is, how we're going to meet this target, having our emissions over the next decade in these two very important sectors. Our third panelist, Dr. Zickfeld, who is in Simon Fraser, she'll be discussing the climate change issues in more detail. So without further ado, or clearing my throat, I will introduce our first speaker, who's Dennis McConaghy from Calgary. Dennis has more than 30 years' experience in the Canadian energy industry and is a prominent commercial executive while working on Keystone XL within TransCanada Pipelines, which is now just TC, from its conception in 2006 to the finalization of commercial agreements in 2008. He is currently a visiting fellow at the Ivey Business School at Western University and an adjunct fellow at, at the Niskanen Center, a DC-based think tank on carbon and energy policy. Dennis has published 2 books over the past few years. In 2017, he published Dysfunction, Canada After Keystone XL, analyzing the Keystone XL experience and its implications for Canada. As well, he continues to be an active commentator on current energy and carbon policy issues. A few weeks ago, Dennis had a second book published, Break Down the Last 4 Years of Pipeline Frustration in Canada. So with that, I'll stop hacking away and wheezing up here, and I'll ask Dennis to present. Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to thank Dalhousie for inviting me here. I think anything that allows an opportunity for more people to actually get to this part of the country from Western Canada is in of itself.
Come to the podium, please.
Oh, okay, sure. All right. I wanted to start by just thanking Dalhousie for inviting me here. I think any opportunities that allow for more exchanges across the country, and especially face-to-face, is just invaluable when there's so many significant policy issues to have a vigorous national debate on. And what I want to just use my 10 minutes or so is to kind of pose to you what I think is the real fundamental policy question for this country. And it really is, I think can be framed this way. You know, is it possible for this country to capture the economic value from its hydrocarbon potential? And by hydrocarbon potential, just so we're explicit about what that means, today Canada produces around 4 million barrels of crude oil, about 3 million of which is from oil sands. That could be increased by another million barrels a day. In addition to that, there could be upwards of 2 more world-scale LNG facilities, in addition to the one that's currently under construction in British Columbia, all of which, of course, would inescapably mean higher emissions from the production process and from the accounting conventions. That would mean greater emissions within Canada and greater value. Is it possible for Canada to actually find a way to seize that value and still have a credible climate policy? And that, in fact, has been and goes on to be, I think, the fundamental challenge of Canadian energy and carbon policy. And I just want to make a couple of observations, which I'll try to keep as kind of factual as possible, and look forward to the discussion that will follow. But I think it is fair to say that the last 10 years in Canada has been a record of absolute frustration on the realization of market access pipelines for certainly oil sands production. The litany is really obvious with Northern Gateway, which was approved but essentially nullified by the Trudeau government. It's one of the first things that it did in 2015 by implementing the tanker ban, and then subsequently by choosing not to remedy some of the deficiencies which the Federal Court of Appeal had cited in the Harper government approval. The loss of Energy East, which others can elaborate, but that option TransCanada persevered with into 2017, and eventually that was lost as really the regulatory framework changed with an uncertainty that became impossible for TransCanada and its shippers to continue with. KXL, although revived by the Trump administration, is still faces an uncertain situation as to whether both American courts and American politics will actually let that thing get to construction, or if it gets to construction, will they actually let it operate? And then lastly, the uncertainties related to TMX, which are still, notwithstanding the federal government has spent $4.5 billion sustaining that project, it is still shrouded with various legal uncertainties, the most recent of which occurred about a month ago when the Federal Court of Appeal, for the second time, granted leave to appeal to address whether or not the federal government had appropriately discharged its consultation obligations in respect of the decision that it made to reapprove that pipeline. All of which is a source of huge frustration, while at the same time, as that has unfolded, we've had a Canadian carbon policy at the federal level that's really been typified by 2 basic features. A set of emission reduction targets that Canada still, by even its own acknowledgement, have had somewhere between negligible progress in actually having clear line of sight advancements to how those targets are going to be realized. And just to give you a sense of what's implied, our Paris targets would imply roughly a 25% reduction of national emissions by 2030. So that's essentially going from 725 megatons a year to a number around 525. How that would be done is still escapes any real clarity. And notwithstanding, there's the continuing statement that we are going to achieve that. Well, at the same time, we still do not have, and I find this regrettable, a national consensus around what policies are we going to use to actually get there. One of which, obviously, would be a national consensus, and by this I mean not just by the current government, but by all political actors in this country, for a transparent and uniform system of carbon pricing across the country that would be applicable to all emissions. And of course, the only way to actually have transparency and uniformity is through carbon taxes, and carbon taxes that are applicable to all emissions generated in the country. Now, at the moment, the question for Canada is, if we're going to pursue and capture the economic value, we're going to have rising physical emissions, or we're not going to meet these targets. But we might have internalized the of those emissions by how we position that carbon tax. And I would submit that is actually the only path forward for this country that is a balance between its economic self-interest and having credibility on doing its part on climate change. And let me close with one other perspective. And, this, I think, is validated if anyone wants to examine current estimates by the International Agency, the American Energy Information Agency, or even entities like ExxonMobil, BP, who publish annually forecasts of global oil and gas demand. Both of those hydrocarbons are still projected to have somewhere between constant to growing demand out to the middle of this decade. So that the world itself, notwithstanding the Paris targets, notwithstanding 1.5 C temperature containment, we still live in a world that is probably unable to do without hydrocarbons. And of course, the point for Canada is, if we choose to simply decarbonize and stop any kind of further development of our hydrocarbon resources, it may not make any difference to the world's response with respect to hydrocarbon demand, or the fact that there are other entities that are prepared to supply that demand. And this is true for heavy oil as much as it is for natural gas and other forms of hydrocarbons. So I look forward to a discussion about, is Canada going to find this balance through carbon pricing, but not open-ended carbon pricing, because surely we wouldn't have carbon prices in this country in excess of $100 a ton, for instance, which we might have to impose if we were ever going to come close to meeting our current targets, in a world where the people we trade with can barely bring themselves to impose $20 a ton, which is in fact what California has achieved. It's what the EU has achieved to date as a matter of actual results when one looks at the results of their trading systems. So, this is really the question for Canada, and it is going to be played out ultimately by our politics and about the national policy debate that surrounds it. So I'm just going to pose that and look forward to the discussion that follows. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Our next panelist is Jacques Poitras. Many of you know Jacques from the CBC, listening to CBC Radio. He's been a political reporter in New Brunswick for 2 decades. He's also the author of 5 books, including Pipe Dreams, The Fight for Canada's Energy Future, and the national bestseller, Irving versus Irving, Canada's Feuding Billionaires and the Stories They Won't Tell. Jacques lives in Fredericton. Jacques?
Thank you. When I woke up this morning at the hotel, I looked out the window and I saw the wreckage of that crane that collapsed during Dorian, so a good extreme weather link to get the discussion going about climate and oil. The question I posed when I started working on my book about Energy East is sort of similar to the question that Larry's posing here, and what I asked was, is consensus possible in Canada on oil, energy, and climate? And I went in with three assumptions. One is that dramatic emissions reductions are necessary from a climate point of view. Second was that any such reductions would have a dramatic impact on the Canadian economy, particularly Alberta and Saskatchewan, and that in a federation this has to be acknowledged and dealt with in some way. And third, that Indigenous people have a role in this debate that is not just that of any other stakeholder, but is of prime concern. So for those of you who don't know, what I did was I drove the length of the Energy East route, the proposed route, from Hardisty, Alberta to St. John, two separate road trips. I spoke to supporters, opponents, environmentalists, oil industry people, mayors, First Nations chiefs, and others. And if you're at all interested in how one goes about doing this, I wrote a piece that's on Medium, and if you just Google my name and Medium and Pipe Dreams, you'll find it, where I sort of described how this trip unfolded, how I researched it. But what I found was two entrenched sides in this debate, and not a lot of good faith movement towards the middle, and not a lot of trying to find a middle ground. There's obvious contributors to this that are much discussed, such as political partisanship, polarization, social media's tendency to reduce every policy debate to an online misinformed shouting match. But that's where we are. So what I thought I would do is just sort of sketch the political tug of war that happened over the last decade over pipelines, and then touch on a couple of points at the end. 2008, the Liberals campaigned on the green shift, which was a carbon price. And it was perhaps a carbon price in its purest form, a price on carbon and then a corresponding reduction in other taxes, income taxes and so on. This is seemingly a market-based solution. It addresses the demand for carbon that many people in the oil industry says is what is driving emissions. If we want to reduce emissions, we need to address demand. Stephen Harper, of course, campaigned against it, and while he didn't win a majority, he increased his seats and stayed in power. And so at that point, we can see that a carbon price has become a wedge issue. When Harper took office, he did take some modest actions on emissions, but as of 2008, he realized that opposition to carbon price was a winning issue. The following year, President Obama fails to get his cap and trade plan through Congress, and he now goes looking for some other kind of win on the environment that doesn't require legislation, because by 2010 the Republicans control Congress and he can't legislate. And at the same time, there's some opposition to Keystone XL in Nebraska. Activists in the U.S. began pressuring him for action, and lo and behold, in 2011, he tells Stephen Harper he's going to delay issuing a permit for a while. This, of course, eventually turned into a total rejection. And as Alison Redford, the former Premier of Alberta, told me when I interviewed her for the book, when the President of the United States says, "I'm interested in a pipeline," everyone's interested in a pipeline. So pipelines moved to the forefront of the debate over climate policy. In BC, the Northern Gateway hearings happened. Activists used what they called the mob the mic strategy to flood the public hearings with opposition, people speaking against the Northern Gateway pipeline. The federal government responded to this by introducing Bill C-38 and C-45, so this changed the NEB approval process to limit participation to those directly affected or with relevant information and expertise. There's an arguable case for that, but those bills also weakened protections for watercourses, narrowed the definition of environmental impacts, and gave the cabinet the power to overrule an NEB rejection of a project. Previously, if the NEB rejected a project, it didn't even go to cabinet. This provoked environmental activists even more. This spawned Idle No More. Positions began to harden. At one point, just checking my time here, a year or two later, Keystone XL is stalled, Northern Gateway is stalled, Energy East is born, and now we have a truly national pipeline question. Early on, there's not a lot of opposition to Energy East. We don't really hear about it at first, but over time, particularly in Quebec, people latch onto this project and oppose it. In 2014, Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois, who was a leader of the student marches in Quebec, won the Governor General's Literature Award for nonfiction in French for his memoir of these famous student protests in Quebec, and on the most watched talk show in Quebec announced that he was donating his prize to Culpa Chez Nous, which was an anti-Energy East group, and challenged viewers to match his donation. Within a week, they raised $400,000. Suddenly, they had the resources for staff, for projects, and they began seeding opposition groups along the route in Quebec. Then we have Rachel Notley elected in Alberta, Justin Trudeau elected nationally, and the push for a climate plan. And this is this has been referred to as the grand bargain. This is Justin Trudeau and Rachel Notley saying, we will put in place climate policies, including a carbon price, and this will buy us public goodwill among opponents, among climate activists, so that we can get these pipelines built. Conversely, we'll get these pipelines built, and this will persuade consumers and those reliant on the oil industry for their livelihood to accept carbon pricing. Then, of course, opposition increases. Trump is elected. Keystone XL comes back to life, as Dennis and I have discussed. And Northern Gateway is canceled, but Trans Mountain is going through its process slowly. And suddenly we have two pipelines, Keystone XL and Trans Mountain, that are not a slam dunk, but that are inching forward again. The NEB announces new criteria for Energy East. There's a whole story behind that unfortunately we don't have time to go through. But they canceled the project in 2017. And so now we're left with a polarized country. We're in the middle of an election campaign. We have Trudeau-friendly governments across the country going down to defeat, challenging his carbon tax, and the question becomes, can the center hold? I question whether opponents of pipelines really chose the correct target. Through my research, I came to wonder whether the pipeline was the proper target for climate activists. Energy East was canceled. It doesn't seem to have made a big dent in emissions. Oil by rail, which several industry people told me was the worst option. One of them told me it's a terrible option, unsafe, dangerous. Actually reached record levels in the summer of 2018 and the later part of 2018. These are potentially lethal bombs traveling through Canadian cities. And even though the cars are safer than they used to be, this is the option that the industry said had to be avoided. But the market dictates that oil has to move, and it's moving. So perhaps there needs to be an acceptance that the economy is not going to decarbonize overnight, and that there needs to be a search for more incremental gains. That's how a democracy works. We have to move the ball down the field one step at a time. I wonder if the cap in Alberta, the emissions cap, is really the key element in this debate. Rachel Notley legislated a cap of 100 megatons of emissions, which we estimate will be reached around 2030. Maybe the better target is to look at that cap. Don't try to kill a pipeline, but look at that cap. Maybe try to move up the date. Maybe try to lower the number gradually. Because if the cap is in place and enforced, the pipeline question will take care of itself. In other words, investors and producers will make their decisions accordingly to comply with the cap. For the industry and their supporters in the political realm have kind of become blended into a single idea, but or a single player, but within the industry, there's plenty of evidence that some of the big producers understand that there's a need for climate action. The CEO of Suncor, Steve Williams, a few years ago, did an on-stage interview where he said that the last barrel of oil in Alberta is going to be very expensive and very dirty to extract because of what the oil sands are. And he'd frankly like to leave it there, but that political pressure from governments and from Alberta policy was pushing him to extract it. And he wanted a 20-year plan, not a plan built on 4-year election cycles. Just a note about Energy East and the idea of reviving Energy East. I actually interviewed Dennis last week for a CBC story about this new proposal. I do find it interesting that the Saudi sourcing has become such an issue. Irving's been getting oil from Saudi Arabia since the 1960s, and no one has raised the alarm about the Saudis' appalling human rights record or suggested it as a reason to not buy their oil until pipeline proponents were on the defensive in the last 5 years. What's going to happen in this election? What happens after? It's hard to say. I still wonder if, as I said, if oh, there's my timer. If that cap is the key to this. One can imagine perhaps a compromise where TMX goes ahead in return for Jason Kenney keeping that cap in place and maybe toughening it and planning for what may be a necessary long-term gradual drawdown of the reliance on carbon. Thank you.
Okay. Our third and final panelist is Dr. Kirsten Zickfeld, an associate professor in the Department of Geography at Simon Fraser University, where she's been since 2010. She has a PhD in climate physics from the University of Potsdam in Germany. Her primary research interests are in the long-term effects of human activities on the climate. She is known internationally for her research on the reversibility of human-induced climate change, carbon budgets consistent with climate targets and climate feedbacks. She served as a lead author of last October's release of the IPCC Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees, and as a lead author of the upcoming IPCC 6th Assessment Report. Dr. Zickfeld?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, thanks, Larry, for and the organizer for inviting me as part of this panel. So I'm going to share my slides. So did they show up?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I have been invited here to give a climate perspective on this panel. And you will see that this is quite a different story than the one that has been told so far. So I would like to start by saying that climate change is here now. Globally, temperatures have warmed by about 1 degree Celsius since we started fueling our industry with fossil fuels in the late 19th century. And as you can see on the slide here, this warming is distributed quite unequally. So the more intense the red, the warmer the climate since pre-industrial times. And what you see here is that especially the high latitudes have warmed disproportionately. And in fact, Canada has warmed twice as much as the rest of the globe. So this means about 2 degrees since the beginning of the industrial era. And if you look at the smaller panels, especially the one on the left, where there's a lot of purple in the northern high latitudes, so this is the panel for winter. And you'll see that a lot of this warming has been realized in the winter. And this warming of 1 degree to date, which is mostly which can be more largely attributed to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions from burning of fossil fuels, from deforestation, from agricultural practices, already had a number of observable impacts on people, on livelihoods, on ecosystems. So there are a number of extreme events that can be clearly attributed to climate change. So we've seen more frequent and intense heavy rainfall. Here is an example from Houston, which was struck by Hurricane Harvey in August 2017, which dumped 1.5 meters of rainfall in certain locations. And science shows that about 40% of this rainfall can clearly be attributed to human influence. And this hurricane had something in common with Dorian that Halifax experienced at the tail end of, in that it was very slow moving. So these systems have become slower, and they tend to stall over areas for a very long time, which then makes them more damaging, which is a new feature that we're observing in hurricanes. We've also seen more frequent and intense droughts. An example here is from California, which was also shown to have been made 20% more severe due to climate change. We've seen more fires, especially here in the West and British Columbia in 2017, 2018. We had very severe fires that burned more than 1 million hectares of forest, and which actually inflicted firefighting costs of 350 billion Canadian dollars per year. And this fire weather has become more frequent, again due to more frequent drought, but also more intense heat. We're also seeing our ice disappear, so glaciers are melting, ice sheets, sea ice cover is decreasing in the summer. And here just one example from Alberta, so the Athabasca Glacier in 1919 and in 2005. So this is actually 40 years ago, and it has receded more since. And this is actually quite significant because a lot of our freshwater supply in Canada is tied to glaciers and to snow. And as glaciers melt and the extent of snow cover decreases, this affects the supply of fresh waters to rural but also urban areas. So we're seeing a number of impacts worldwide that can be clearly attributed to climate change. And if we continue our current trajectory, then this is actually going to get a lot worse. So here on the right-hand side, the panel with all the red colors, this is the warming at the end of the century if we follow a so-called business as usual trajectory, which is the trajectory that we're on right now. So globally, along this trajectory, temperatures would warm by 4 degrees. But then again, if you look at this map, you see that the warming is intensified at high latitudes. So in Canada, we would see something like 5 to 7 degrees of warming. And in the Arctic, up to sort of something around 10 degrees. And this is really a world which is unlike the one we know. So this means disruption of atmospheric circulation, disruption of ocean currents. It means shrinking glaciers, no sea ice in the summer in the Arctic, very little sea ice in the summer, in the austral summer, and then in the southern hemisphere. It means a world without coral reefs, a world where many other species will go extinct, and where hundreds of millions of people will be at risk of hunger and facing water insecurity issues, which then could lead to conflict. And countries have agreed that this is actually not a world they want. And so in 2015, when nations gathered in Paris, they committed to holding the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial level, and actually to pursue efforts in the long term to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So this is the so-called Paris Agreement So relative to this business as usual trajectory that I illustrated, this would prevent or avoid some of the more catastrophic damages, but still at 1.5 and 2 degrees, we would see some climate impact. So again, just to remind you, we're now at 1 degree and we're already seeing a lot of impacts. So as we go to 1.5 and 2, even then these impacts will worsen. So a 1.5 or 2 degree world will be a world where we can avoid the worst, but no means a world without climate impact. So we will still have to adapt to some extent. So now the question is, how do we get there? And this is a question the IPCC special report on the global warming on 1.5 tried to answer in its report last year. And so the slide I'm showing here shows an emission pathway. So these are emissions distributed over time. So they start in 2010 on the left-hand side and go to 2100. And these gray lines, so these are different possible trajectories. So there's not just one trajectory that takes us to 1.5, but there's actually a range of trajectories, which are then and the range is shown by this light blue shaded area. However, all these pathways, they have 3 characteristics in common. So first of all, if we aim to limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees, then we need a robust decline in greenhouse gas emissions over the next decade. So this is shown in this area that is indicated by A. And in fact, in 10 years from now, globally, we need to reduce our emissions by half. The second characteristic, which is illustrated by B, is that all of these pathways, they reach net zero emissions by mid-century. So net zero here means that any remaining emissions that are difficult to eliminate, so especially those from agriculture, need to be compensated by deliberate removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And we can do this through natural means by strengthening carbon sinks such as forests or the ocean carbon sink, or via technology, which however is not mature yet. And then C, so this is this area tour, so this would be the case in the second half of this century. We actually do need removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to exceed emissions. And if you look at the numbers, you see that here emissions drop below zero. So in fact, we need emissions to drop below zero. And the reason is that we've waited so long to reduce our emissions that actually, in order to meet these targets, we need to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in order to stay within a carbon budget. Okay, so my last slide then ask, what does this mean for the oil for the energy industry? And again, the IPCC looked at these numbers globally, so all of these analyses are global. And but sort of they did as guidelines, they also apply to industry. And just perhaps as a note on something Ben has actually said earlier, so these scenarios are different from those of natural energy, because they do not rely to a large extent on this technology that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. If we assume that we can deploy those at very large scale, then we wouldn't be able to emit a little bit more. But again, as I said earlier, these technologies are still flying in the sky, so they happen. Okay, so let's look at, oops, there's something closer. So let's look at the next slide. Okay, so this is again from the IPCC analysis. And what this analysis shows is that in order for emissions to be consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need energy demand to be reduced largely, so by 15% in 2030 and 32% in 2050. And this is relative to 2010 value. So all these numbers here are relative to 2010. Also, primary energy from oil will have to be reduced by 37% in 2030 and actually close to 90% in 2050. Whereas primary energy from gas will have to be reduced by a quarter in 2030 and by 3/4 in 2050, again, relative to 2010. So what this illustrates very clearly is that a world that is consistent with 1.5 and an emission pathway that actually takes us there has very little room for energy from oil and gas. So first of all, there is no room for expansion, and over the next 3 decades, these sources of energy will have to be largely phased out. So if we're aiming for 1.5. So just a brief summary of my key points. So climate change is already affecting people, ecosystems, and livelihoods. Climate change in excess of the Paris goals, 1.5 or 2 degrees, will have catastrophic consequences that will lead to a world which is very unlike the one we know and where our civilizations have developed. And to limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, greenhouse gas emissions need to be reduced by half over the next 10 years. And they need to reach net zero by mid-century. And finally, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees will require phase out of fossil fuels by mid-century. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. We'll now open the floor to questions. However, we have 2 student questions initially. Oh, I see you're doing the mic. All right.
Larry, so just that you know, so there's quite a bit of feedback on your end.
Okay.
So I will let you know if I cannot hear clearly.
Hi, my name's Jack Campbell. I'm a graduate engineering student at Tallahassee. This question is for Dennis. Sorry?
Kirsten can't hear from that microphone, so
Oh, sure.
just from the room microphone.
So in many countries, there have been efforts to decarbonize our energy through plans such as the Paris Accord. Do you think that, or despite this, sorry, global consumption of oil is expected to go up in the next decade substantially? Do you think that we have a responsibility to meet this demand with oil produced more cleanly and safely in Canada than might be done elsewhere, and really look at global emissions rather than just within what we can do in our own borders?
I'd make a couple of comments. First, any increase of Canadian oil supply or LNG production is going to mean more net emissions in Canada. Now, there may be some offset if LNG is a global emissions situation, notwithstanding methane leaks and the impact that they have as a more a worse GHG than just CO2. So I stipulate that to begin with. The issue is the economic trade-off between the economic cost of actually trying to contain emissions to 1.5 to 2 in a world that has yet shown no capacity to take on that economic cost. And that, again, is the central question here. The idea that we could decarbonize, which effectively would mean either producing most of our energy as electricity from non-emissive sources, or simply reducing demand and hoping that a reduction of absolute energy demand did not itself imply a reduction in economic output globally. My own view is that it is more likely that the world will reach an emissions level more consistent with a 3 degrees C increase in global temperatures, and that there will be a significant amount of adaptation around that, provided the world can find a way of having a carbon policy that allows carbon pricing to really allow that adaptation and, to some extent, mitigation to occur. But, I mean, at this point, from a purely, like, how would you do it, the reliance on nuclear, renewables, and advancements in storage would have to be a step change improvement from what anyone could see today, or else the world will have much higher energy costs, even if they've contained the risk of the kinds of impacts that were attributed to our current trans-continue pathway. So, I mean, it is enormous. It is an enormous undertaking for the world to change out its energy systems to take this risk down to the levels that are suggested by 1.5 or 2 degrees temperature containment.
Would anyone else like to address that? Kirsten?
Just a moment there, Kirsten. I'll just, I had you muted, so you're back on. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, I would like to respond to that. So first of all, in this IPCC report, we showed that reaching 1.5 is in fact extremely challenging, but that it is possible, and that we have the technology at hand. And of course, there are costs for this for this energy transition. However, when we talk about cost, sort of what I find is that often we talk about the cost of reducing emissions, but we never talk about the costs that we're actually trying to avoid. I mean, the reason in the first place that we're trying to mitigate climate change is that we want to avoid the damages. And these damages are massive. So there's an estimate from the National Roundtable on Energy and the Environment, which puts the costs of climate change in, so by mid-centuries, between 25, 23, and 43 billion Canadian dollars. So this is a huge price tag. And so we're seeing this. We've seen the costs of disasters going up. So the Fort McMurray fire is the costliest disaster in Canadian history at about $10 billion. Same with sort of the Alberta flood, which also comes in close to $5 billion. So we have we have these extremely costly disasters, and actually the Insurance Bureau of Canada has been recording a rise in the claim as a result of disasters that are linked to extreme weather. So they now pay out in excess of $1 billion in insurance claims per year, up to 400 million just a decade ago. And this is to say that when we talk about costs, there's actually two sides of the equation. Yes, it will cost money to transition to a carbon-free energy system, but if we do not do that, then we will incur even more money. Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Devin Drover. I'm a fourth-year MBA JD student. My question is for Jacques, who recently reported on a attempt to revive Energy East as a P3 arrangement. And I guess my question is whether or not you see a path forward in that revival as a P3 arrangement if the federal Liberals are re-elected, especially given their precedent of purchasing Trans Mountain, and as well the political realities of the loss of seats in New Brunswick.
Well, since I reported on that in my CBC job, I won't give you my opinion, but I'll give you my observations and my analysis. And actually, when I was reporting this story last week, I interviewed Dennis, so he may want to jump in as well. The narrative has been that the Liberal government killed Energy East by basically setting a policy direction where the NEB adopted higher environmental standards that made it untenable for TransCanada to continue the application process. That may be a factor, but the other undeniable fact is that the business case for Energy East had changed from 2013 to 2017. Dennis knows a lot about this as well, but When it was first conceived, it was called by Bloomberg News a Hail Mary pass, or a moonshot. There were, as I said earlier, there were 2 other pipelines that were held up. The price of oil was very high, and so TransCanada could build a pipeline across the country that was actually going to convert two-thirds of the project was going to be converted gas line. So they didn't actually have to build that new. That lowered the upfront capital cost. That made it possible for them to charge lower tolls to suppliers. Those tolls, as a share of the barrel price, were tiny. When the barrel price goes down, the toll takes up is a larger part of the cost. And we have 2 pipelines seemingly going ahead, and this proponent is proposing to build entirely new from one end to the other, not using that what was excess capacity that TransCanada had. So I think the odds of it are tough. Now, in terms of the federal government buying another pipeline, the people who support pipelines and the energy industry in a very sort of partisan, rhetorical way lamented this. So I'm not sure if they would welcome doing it again. It is true, I think, with where things are going policy-wise and that changing business case, that it's, I said in the book that the Trans Mountain saga sort of takes us back to the construction of the first gas line in the 1950s, where the federal government had to invest in the project to get it done and overcome various hurdles. So we're sort of back to where we started with pipelines in Canada, that something can't happen without the government playing a role. There's a lot of analysis that Trans Mountain may be the last major pipeline project in Canada because where the world is going on climate policy, even if it's not going far enough, the oil sands are expensive to extract from. Many of the major international players have pulled out because of those costs. So there isn't a need for a third pipeline right now, and there may never be a need for a third pipeline. And I'm not sure how much of this proposal is based on a business calculation and how much is based on the fact that at the political and partisan level, there's a lot of rhetorical support for the general idea.
I would just add that any revival of a project that looked like Energy East would be extremely challenging, and it would probably require the demise of TMX and KXL for even that conversation to start. I would like just to make one very brief comment to the remarks that Kirsten made. I agree with her. You do want to have a carbon pricing model that is the net of the costs of climate change minus the benefits that you are losing. And so I've always been a proponent that the social cost of carbon is where you should be ultimately trying to get your carbon taxes to. And you obviously, in the realities of where we're at, there's probably the need to get to there on some kind of a gradualist pathway. All I'm saying is that the debate around what that social cost of carbon is will ultimately be a political decision based on how much of that trade-off between the costs of what we're trying to avoid versus the increased cost of actually providing basic energy. And just as a benchmark, the value loss of not having these pipelines in terms of the hydrocarbons which could have been exported the last 10 years are numbers that are in and of themselves measured annually, whether you want to be conservative at the low end of around 5 billion to the more extreme end of 20 billion. So, I agree, you want to have a carbon policy design based on a social cost of carbon estimate, and it has always been my view that the IPC process would have been more productive if it had framed its work in that way, as opposed to simply the course that it has taken, which has been to date to allocate specific emission reduction targets to individual countries. Thank you.
Can I just add one more thing? Just on carbon pricing, this election that's coming up, every election is described by every party leader as a pivotal election, but should the Liberals be reelected, it will be quite a watershed moment where a party that has brought in a price on carbon is rewarded for it at the ballot box. And that would be a very, very significant moment, I think, politically. I always think that the imposition of these measures, the new measure is the hard part, where the level should be when we talk about what the carbon price should be. The challenge, the psychological hurdle with the electorate is to put it in place in the first place. Once it's there and it stays there for a while, then policymakers can debate where it should go in the future. So it's a very interesting moment that's coming up.
Add something on the social cost of carbon.
Yes, please.
So I just would like to briefly explain why the IPCC didn't come up with that number. It has to do with the fact that economic valuation of impacts is very problematic and is actually very value laden. So as soon as we start assigning monetary values to something, this obviously depends very much on our on what we value, which differs very much between generations. It differs between countries. So finding sort of a global way of actually sort of valuing impact, especially if we talk about non-monetary impact, like things like biodiversity, like recreation. So these things have a different value to different people. And so first of all, trying to monetize impacts, and then to aggregate these impacts to a global number is something which is very contentious, and this is the main reason that the IPCC stayed away from.
Okay. We'll now open questions to the floor. You're asked to direct your question to a single panelist, and after that, other panelists can jump in and make their comments and so forth. So, anyone?
Can I just add, sorry, that Kirsten can hear you from this tower at the spot, so try to project your voice to that location so to allow her to be heard, to allow her to hear you.
Okay, just wanna. Oh shit! Hold on. Kirsten, you'll have to repeat what you said. Apologies.
So I will let you know if I don't understand.
Hi, my name is Kathleen Mifflin, and I've just finished my Master of Environmental Studies here at Dalhousie. I have a question for Kirsten. In your response earlier, you mentioned that though the 1.5 degree target is extremely challenging, it is theoretically possible to achieve. I'm wondering how the IPCC has arrived at that specific conclusion, and what are the sorts of measures that would need to be taken? What timeline would they need to be taken on, I guess, in Canada and on a global level?
Okay, so I did not hear the entire question, but I think I got the sense of it. So I think the question was, so I said that achieving 1.5 is challenging but not impossible. And so the question is, sort of what are some measures that we need to undertake to actually get there? Is that correct?
No, it was how did you reach the conclusions you did, I believe.
Yes, it was a two-part question. So how do we know that it's possible? And if it is possible, what are the sorts of measures that have to be taken to get there? I guess they go hand in hand, really.
Okay. Yeah. So this is based on a very lengthy analysis in the report. And so first of all, what the report concluded is that there is no single technology that actually can get us there. So there's no silver bullet, but we actually need a portfolio of different measures. So both on the energy demand side, So things like increasing energy efficiency, and both on the supply side, which means how energy is produced. And so there sort of so we need changes in all sectors. So it's not something that can be tackled, let's say, by the transportation sector or by the energy sector, but really these emission reductions need to come from all sectors. They also need to come from individuals. So the IPCC report also showed that in order to achieve that, we also need behavioral changes. So we need people to make their different choices when they decide where to travel, what to eat, how much to consume and to buy. And then lastly, what the report also indicated that because we've waited so long to do something, and we're still waiting. So I mean, our global emissions haven't peaked yet. So we're still on an increasing trajectory. Because we have delayed action, we actually need to come up with ways to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And the reason is that carbon dioxide is a very long-lived gas. So once it is in the atmosphere, it stays there for a very long time, which means centuries to actually millennia. So even if we stop emitting greenhouse gases now, or carbon dioxide now, the concentration of this gas in the atmosphere will decrease only very slowly. So, so in order to compensate for the excess carbon that was emitted in the past, we would need to start to take some of that out of the atmosphere. Okay, so again, sort of different portfolio of measures. All sectors need to participate. We also need behavioral change, and this cannot be done without actively removing carbon dioxide.
Okay, next question. We're up. That's all.
Hi, my name is Tina, and I'm a master's student here studying chemistry, and I specifically study energy storage devices, lithium-ion batteries to be precise, and the whole point of this is that we really want to implement this into our future cars and to our grid energy storage perhaps. But with that context in mind, I have been going to more of these policy discussions coming from kind of a science background because I'm not really familiar with this. But from what I've gathered, carbon emissions, a lot of it is coming from our transportation. Every day, people driving their cars, semi-articulate, or these semi-trucks, transporting everything. I'm just thinking on a policy level, we have to, I think, kind of go back to, cities and see how can we change our infrastructure to make it easier for people to adapt to, more clean, energy conscious methods of travel. But I just, like when we're talking about, the pipelines and things like that, yes, that's on a really big scale, but considering what's the biggest source of emission is from the transportation industry, and we want to reduce the amount of oil that we need to kind of invest it into the public infrastructures in Halifax and things like that, because then you don't need to drive a car. So sorry for this long-winded question, but I'm just wondering, maybe Kirsten or anyone else on the panel, like in a policy way, how is it best to convince local governments, provincial governments to invest into infrastructure or things like that would make it easier for myself and anyone else to try to live more green? Thank you.
I could jump in on that, I guess.
Okay.
I mean, the pipeline question and the transportation question are not separate questions at all, because the cars are fueled by gas combustion engine, which derives from oil. And this does return to the carbon tax argument. I mean, the whole notion of the carbon tax is that gradually over time, as it creeps up, this will send a price signal to consumers who will make better choices. And many economists have studied this, and it's a complex topic, but in essence, carbon tax doesn't mean that everyone will, the carbon tax will not mean that everyone will start taking the bus the day it takes effect, but that over time, as that cost of filling a car at the gas pump goes up, that more and more people, a segment of that market will make better decisions. They'll opt for an electric car. The price point of an electric car right now is out of reach for a lot of people. As the carbon tax creeps up and the technology of the electric car, and maybe your batteries will help in this regard, as those price points converge, it becomes an easier behavioral choice for the consumer. So that's, I think that is part of the answer, is those kinds of policy mechanisms.
I would just add this, and I think this is obvious to anyone who's thought about this. There's really two choices here. There can be a massive amount of government intervention on a grand scale to mandate the kinds of transformational changes, one of which would be greater urban density. Because if people actually were forced to live more densely, you could get other economies in your energy systems, not to mention making public transportation systems inherently more economic than what certainly North America has evolved to. So the choice is a massive set of interventions which would be consistent with reducing carbon footprints. And whether or not that cost is actually politically sustainable, is sort of the question at hand. Again, this brings me back to the point of carbon taxes, which is why at least the world of economics and engineering is biased towards that approach, because it ultimately is rooted, regardless of how difficult it is to actually do this calculation, on some sense of what is the social cost of carbon. What is the actual cost of trying to reduce this risk? And of course, it is problematic because it gets into the difficult subject of discount rates, which is a generational issue, and also some other impacts that are not the kind that people like to generally want to objectively measure. Like, what is the cost of not just human life, because there's serious health issues that go into that calculation, but also the impacts on certain way that people have become accustomed to living. But I would just make the choice, or the comment, that the choice of policy at its most fundamental is, are we going to opt for, in terms of developed economies, massive intervention into our economic systems to deal with this problem, this risk, or are we going to opt for something more gradualist, which, of course, takes you to carbon pricing, and I am an advocate of carbon pricing. The question is, for Canada, that pricing can't get out of line with what the rest of the world is prepared to impose on itself. And at the moment, Canada is actually in the vanguard of carbon pricing because our price is about as high as anyone else has imposed on itself to date.
I'll just add on the question of massive intervention. One of the merits of the carbon tax among the people who study these questions is that it's the least intrusive measure. Because if you pass regulations saying refinery X or pipeline company Y, you've got to reduce your emissions by this rate, they've got to spend an enormous amount of money developing ways to do that. If you can nudge the consumer behavior 1 degree or 1% a year, 2% a year, 3% a year in the direction that you want, that's a much less expensive solution for the economy as a whole. At least that's what the experts tell me.
Kirsten? Oh, Kirsten, do you want to respond?
I don't think I have anything to add to that.
Next question? Anyone? In the middle there?
Hi there, my name's Logan Lawrence. I'm a PhD candidate in the PhD health program here at Dalhousie. I have a question, I guess it's mostly for Jacques, but both Kirsten and Dennis have talked about value and where we place value. And I'm wondering, as someone who's studied or researched all along the spectrum of people who have opinions around pipelines, do you feel like it's a knowledge problem where if only one side understood something about the other, we'd find a way to kind of achieve a middle ground? Or are these two extremes just looking at the world from different paradigms?
I've got a book for you. I think That's a large question. Certainly, I think there have been times in this debate where each side, and I don't think you can dumb it down to two sides. It's not that simple. Where each side has assumed the worst of the other side. So when I was interviewing one of Stephen Harper's advisors on the rationale for Bill C-38 and Bill C-45, he said, you know, the pipeline opponents are fundamentalist, basically, in their opposition, and if you increase public consultation by 10%, you're not going to lower pipeline opposition by 10%. It's just, so there was a sort of view of just sort of writing them off. But, you know, we have seen in some possibility of middle ground recently. I mean, support for Trans Mountain actually went up in BC as that debate unfolded, but support for climate action as a general concept has also increased nationwide. That's why when I talk about that grand bargain involving the cap, that's where I sort of see the elements of that. But some pipeline opponents have also lumped in the industry and conservative parties and everyone else as one big sort of monolithic demon, and I think that's incorrect as well. You know, we had some of the major oil producers in Alberta on the podium with Rachel Notley in 2015 when she announced her climate plan, and they were signing on for it. Some of the smaller players were not signing on for various reasons, but I would say that the you know, the talk of reviving Energy East, for example, is comes from a lot of people who are looking for votes, but you don't see it being tossed out by a lot of people who have to report to shareholders and have to raise find investors. So there are gradients or levels within what are supposedly two camps, and you know, there's been polling as well by Abacus a couple of years ago that found that some of these things are hard to square the circle. I mean, Christian Science is irrefutable in my mind. It's what has to happen. Whether it's politically possible to get there is a question. But the polling has suggested that people are prepared to accept some level of climate action, and so where exactly that is in the middle is the question. But I think the potential is there for it.
I'd only make this comment. I have yet to see conclusive evidence that any major developed economy actually wants to pay for serious climate action. It's one thing to say I'm for it and I want something to be done about it, but if it personally impacts, which is again why so often carbon taxes have been resisted. And in fact, there's been places such as Washington State where carbon taxes were actually rejected, not just because of those on the right, but those on the left who thought they were ineffective and that better to opt for intervention. So I just make the point, I've yet to see compelling evidence that when people are asked to pay, that they're up for the cost of dealing with the desire to achieve something on climate. And so that is a fundamental political dichotomy, which is reflected in why no action has occurred since 1992 of the kind that has been demanded by the various protests and the thrust of trying to achieve 1.5 temperature containment.
Kirsten?
Yeah, I actually can give a counterexample to that, which is from Germany. So when after the coal era, a red-green government was elected in the 2000s, they put in place a feed-in tariff for renewable energy, so solar and wind. And this is really what globally fueled the rise of the renewable energy industry, because for the first time people produced at scale, which lowered costs considerably. And this actually came at sort of a price tag for consumers, because energy prices really increased during that time. And I think sort of why there was some opposition. I think generally people recognize that that's a necessary step. So So there were, so in the end, or it was an accepted measure. And energy prices have been high since, and there has not been a revolution. Now, unfortunately, sort of after these initial gains, because after Fukushima, nuclear power plants were shut down, which led to a renaissance of coal in Germany, which then sort of offset some of these gains from the renewables. But let's say that's one example where consumers did accept costs of climate.
Try up top here, and then if time, you. So.
Thank you. My name is Melina Kurantidou, and I'm a postdoc here at Dalhousie. I have my class with me today.
Could you speak up, please?
Yes. I'm saying I have my class with me today. It's a graduate class on economics for resource and environmental management. And I just wanted to point out that we need to involve more economics into this discussion. I mean, the last year's Canadian Conference for Resource and Environmental Economics was all focused on the social cost of carbon. And I'm not really sure why it is the case that carbon taxes are not really a favorable policy, but just the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty about how do we do ecosystem valuation and risk and uncertainty on ecosystem valuation of goods and services, that doesn't mean that we should not consider the benefits of carbon taxes. And just to point out, and maybe you may want to comment on this, the IPCC's reports as well do include ways to treat risk and uncertainty, because in climate change science there's a lot of risk and uncertainty, and so is the case with economics. And I think the discussion about how do we value the future and how do we value today is a very important one in terms of how do we choose the discount rate. I mean, after the Trump elections, we saw discount rates that were close to the market rates, close to 7% or even more. And conservationists are talking to discount rates close to 2, 3, even close to 0 if we're talking about the pure time of preference rate. Just a comment.
Oh, so that was more a statement than a question?
But I heartily agree with it.
Okay, we had one more question here, and it has to be short and a question, preferably.
So an interesting thing that I observed, or interesting to me, and my name is Nicole Arsenault, and I'm an interdisciplinary PhD student here at Dal, studying future food scenarios for Canada. I kind of noticed 3 different conceptualizations of this issue in form of key questions. So there was, is it possible for Canada to capture the economic potential of the fossil fuel energy and still have credible climate policy? We had the question of, is consensus possible? And what policy mechanisms are best to sort of get around this lack of consensus? And then we had a simple question of, here are the climate impacts that we're experiencing now, here's the goal, and how do we meet that goal? And it seems to me that this difference of how we conceptualize this problem and the questions that guide our inquiry into this problem are really, really fundamentally reflective of the different paradigms around this issue. And I would suggest that this is where policy plays an integral role, in that we have to have leaders who unite behind the science, who value the future safety, the safety of future generations and of the biosphere, and who ask a question, I would argue, that's closer to Kirsten's. How do we meet this goal, given the technologies that we have in place right now? I'm wondering, from that perspective, if we consider what we value to be the security of future generations, how you would potentially reconceptualize that main question, or would you reconceptualize the main question any differently than you have at the opening of your 3 10-minute talks.
I'll jump in briefly. I mean, it is interesting that I think Dennis's phrasing, there's some effort to say, to calibrate it as, there's this wealth in the ground, and how do we get that wealth out and still do something about climate? I mean, I would start from the more existential climate survival question, and then back up and say what's possible when that is the goal. This is not new territory. I read several, believe it or not, Alberta government budget speeches when I was researching this book, and there were 3 different Alberta finance ministers who all talked about oil as a finite resource, that the Alberta government was too dependent on oil in its day-to-day budget, and that they had to prepare for a day when that resource wasn't available to them because it was going to be depleted. They all said it. I'm not sure that any of them actually changed direction to do it, but the idea that I sometimes hear that it's, save the industry, save the wealth first, and then back into that with climate action, I think that's what you're getting at. It is, there are different ways of conceptualizing it, and I think that goes to the root of the difficulty of finding the consensus.
I'll just make a very brief comment. My experience, and I'm over 60, is that the world does not operate at zero as the discount rates. And that's a real thing, because this, whether or not the appropriate discount rate for doing a social cost of carbon calculation is market rates or not, I'm not entirely sure, but it's my own judgment, it's pretty close to that. And that reality is why the politics have been so difficult. And so I'm just making the observation, real life experience does not actually operate at zero discount rates. And that's just part of this that actually does grind away as to why political action on this has been so difficult to achieve.
Okay, Kirsten, last word to you.
Yes, sir. Unfortunately, I did not hear the question, so perhaps you could briefly sort of repeat the essence.
It was very long.
I think I can sum it up.
Okay.
So I heard 3 very different conceptualizations of this issue through main questions. Yours being, how do we meet these climate goals, and others being more contextualized around also meeting economic goals and also achieving consensus. And I'm wondering if you conceptualize this issue in terms of valuing the security of future generations, would you reconceptualize, I was asking all 3 panels, would you reconceptualize that main question that underpinned your presentation?
Okay, so I think I sort of got the gist of it, but so yeah, so I'm going to respond according to what I got. So I think in terms of a future generation, so this is where the climate impacts will be felt most. So we're already experiencing climate change now, but even if we manage to reduce emissions slightly, the majority of the impacts will be felt in the next decade. And this is really, so this is sort of, as I showed earlier, so this will be a world that will be very difficult to adapt to. So it will be a world of ecological collapse, it will be a world of hunger and of lack of access to clean water. And I really think this should be the first goal, is to actually secure a livable planet for future generations. And then sort of within this goal, the question is, well, what role does the energy sector have? And I think the science there is very clear that if we really aim for stable climate, then there is no, first of all, there cannot be an expansion of this sector. And we will have to contract this sector significantly and actually phase out fossil fuels by mid-century. So going back to this question that was posed at the beginning, is it possible for Canada to seize the value of its energy reserves and at the same time pursue a stable climate? I would answer no. And I think what is really sort of lacking in this country is an honest conversation about that. And I think we would be much better served if we recognize this in terms of, so for energy workers and transitioning them out of energy fuels and retraining them, and also in terms of the economy, because if we continue to live this dream and do not accept the reality, then it will be much more costly.
Okay. Thank you, Kirsten. And so on behalf of the audience, I'd like to thank all our three panelists who've come great distances or transmitted great distances. So thank you, Jacques, Dennis, and Kirsten.